Mem, how's it going?
Very good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Mem, you're from Exumer, and what a lot of people don't know is your other band, Skull Pit
Mhm.
2018.
Yep.
How did that form?
Um, I was a Church of Misery fan for a while, which is Tatsu's main band. And at some point, he noticed on social media that I was wearing T-shirts or whatever. And I have a pretty extensive record collection. I've been posting stuff on my IG account, and he just reached out to me out of the blue. And he said, "Hey man, I seen you've been wearing our shirts. Thank you so much. I've been a huge Exumer fan since the late '80s, and it's an honor for you to wear our shirts and whatnot." And I said, "Hey, that's whatever," but I was really happy about talking to him, and then we just kind of stayed in touch, writing each other, sending each other stuff like records, tapes, whatever, and at some point he sent me these files of these songs, and he said, I would love to do this project. It's very Motorhead heavy, new wave of British heavy metal heavy sounding stuff. Are you interested in it? And I was like, yeah, it's cool. So it kind of like lingered on for a year in my email account. And then I was like, you know what? Let me just throw some vocals, write some lyrics, throw some vocals on those tracks. And then I just developed into those Skull Pit songs. And we said, all right, let's give this a whirl. And we shopped it around a little bit. We had like 10 songs. After I was done recording my vocal tracks, I shopped it around a little bit. And then Metal Blade said, hey, we would like to do, we'd like to at least release one of these records if you do more than one. And I said, yeah, that's cool. And so that's how we ended up releasing that project.
That's awesome. And that's from 2018. Could fans ever expect another release?
So I have three songs demoed right now.
Cool.
So we're working on some stuff. This is it's not like a touring band or anything. It's a project. So we don't really have a timeline for anything. So when we have a little time on our hands and we feel up to doing stuff, that's when we do it. But it's kind of dormant, but at the same time, it's not like I mean, it's an ongoing project. So he'll send me some stuff to demo on and demo vocals on and stuff. And I am actually talking to one of my friends out here who plays drums for Sheer Terror, Anthony, and he's probably going to lay down some drum tracks on those three songs that Tatsu
Awesome.
prepared. So yeah, so it's like a real collab type of thing.
Yeah, that's awesome. And like, fair enough, man, because like Exumer's pretty busy this year.
Yeah.
So, I don't blame you. But I want to go back in time a little bit, like talking about Exumer and whatnot. So like way back 80s, what was your introduction to thrash metal?
But like, I mean, put it this way. I mean, I got into music in the late '70s, and then as the early '80s kicked off, I mean, I started off, like everyone else in Europe, pretty much getting to new wave British heavy metal, um, and still uh, loving the bigger bands as well, such as Priest and Maiden and whatnot. But at that time, they just at least Maiden just had a couple of records out, and I was really into Motorhead. And then I started, I probably the first real thrash, if you want to consider that, was on the Metal Massacre album in '82
Cool.
with Metallica. Um, I think that hit the lights on there, and that was like what is considered traditional thrash at this point. But I also was into Anvil. If you listen to like
Mm.
Metal on Metal, there's some really thrashy songs on there.
Oh
I
yeah.
wasn't that term wasn't coined yet, but so those were the first few things that I kind of consider, or even the first Exciter. There's some real we used to call it speed metal, but if
Yeah.
you think about it, speed metal and thrash. It's kind of like the same thing, especially in those early days. And so that was my introduction. And then really starting it off with, first Metallica album, first Slayer record, and so on. We always thought Slayer was we said Slayer sounds like a mix between Metallica and Venom. So, it had the black metal aspect of Venom, but then, it had like the crisp guitars of Metallica. So that was you kind of like everybody sounded pretty unique, like there wasn't, everybody had their own sound, and that trend actually went throughout the 80s, I believe. And so those were the first beginnings, right? New wave of British heavy metal, then venturing into like heavier stuff. And then as thrash arrived, with Metallica, Slayer, whatnot, I mean, I was right then and there. I mean, I picked up all those records as they were happening. I mean, so.
Yeah, I wish, man. It's a fortune now.
Yeah,
like all those first presses and whatnot.
Right.
Yeah. It's rough, but I find them.
Yeah.
Now, Exumer is one of the coolest names of a band ever. And you said in the past that your dad coined it?
My dad came up with it. Yeah. It was funny.
Happen?
I mean, we were looking for a name, and then and I was fascinated, like, with like I was also fascinated with like bands like Hellhammer and stuff like that, and the imagery of it and death and whatnot, And my dad, he was looking at all the stuff that I was into. And then, he's like, "Oh, you're really interested in like dying things." I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Why don't you kind of like, instead of dying, like resurrect something that's dead and like sort of like exhume something?" And I was like, "Oh, that's cool." And then he said, "You can call yourselves Exumer." And I'm like, "Yeah, that sounds great." And then we just dropped the H to make it our own. And then that's how it all came about. But yeah, my dad was my parents really helped me out back then. They really supported me, and they gave us our first rehearsal space and stuff like that. It was my dad's garage, actually. He had like a car, he was working on cars and stuff, and he had a garage, so he designated a room for us. And cool. That's where we started. So yeah, that's how awesome. All that happened.
Yeah, that's really cool. And to, build upon what you said about the band's imagery. So where does that come from? Is it like a Mad Max inspired character? Is it?
So basically that was the creation of the guy that was drawing our album covers. And, he just came up with the mask concept. It was more like, Friday the 13th.
Yeah.
And he just gave us various ideas, and we liked that the best. And and then back in the day, everybody was trying to get a mascot, and a theme going, and we kind of thought that was really cool because you can build upon that, album for album. And then we kept the mask going up to this day. So it worked out really well. So
yeah. Now, in the past, you've also said that you think Bonded by Blood is the greatest thrash metal album of all time. Do you still stand on that?
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Yeah. 100%. Has Exodus had a major impact on your songwriting in the band? Oh, yeah?
Yeah. I mean, I think, so what happened with that record, that specific record, was we had that album like a year prior to its release.
That's awesome.
So back then in the tape training circles, that record came out like, I think I heard it like summer of 84, or at least fall of 84. It wasn't released until like 85, I think. And so we knew how explosive that record was. By the time it was actually released, some of that steam went away. So Exodus never blew up in the same way that I think they deserved, like Slayer, Metallica, Megadeth, whatever, right? And I think part of that, the reason was that they delayed the release of it, but people who knew had it. So by the time it was released, it was still hot, but it could have been hotter, if you know.
Yeah.
So going back to us being inspired by it. So everyone who was into thrash back then and who was in the underground knew that record. So it was already like by the time we formed Exumer, Ray and I formed Exumer, we were heavily influenced by that record. So and my vocal style was influenced by Paul's vocals. And then
Yeah.
in the winter of '85, when they first came to Europe, that's when we first met them too. Um, uh, we were completely into that band. Like, I mean, it was like a big thing. And then, meeting Paul, and Gary was younger, on the younger side. He's still older than me, but not by a whole lot. But Paul was substantially older. And he
Yeah.
was a character, man.
That's awesome.
It was called
What was it
it
like
was
meeting Paul for the first time?
it was insane. I was like, I think I was like 17 maybe, and I was working for Metal Hammer back then, and
Huh.
we had we had access to them, and so the first thing he said, yeah, cool, nice meeting you. You're a friend of Matthias. Matthias was the uh president of the Venom's Legions in Germany, who also ended up being our manager, but he had, we met Metallica through him. We met all these bands through him because he was a big deal in the German metal scene, and like
Cool.
he had access to all these bands, and we were like, we're all friends from way back. And so I said, yeah, I'm Matthias' friend, and he's like, hey man, um, I have asthma. Give me a second. And he pulled out his asthma pump, and then the next thing he said, oh, do you have any weed on you? I was I was like, we can get things going, but it was like, holy crap, this dude is like off the chain. I mean, that was me at 17 who already kind of like partied and got into things.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, there's this older dude who has asthma and he doesn't care at all.
Yeah.
And, so that was my first impression of Paul. It always stuck. And then even in the '90s when we reconnected, when Exodus reformed in that with Paul in the mid late '90s,
Hmm.
we hung out. I remember, and I'm telling them the story, and he's like, "Yeah, dude, yeah, I was wild." I'm like, "Yeah, you're like you're like, yeah, you made me rethink my 17-year-old self too." I was like, "Maybe I should check
That's awesome. Now speaking of like inspirations and stuff, what are some of your like biggest lyrical inspirations? Do you just
at
pull
the
from like
moment."
thrash metal? Yeah, yeah.
So I kind of like, back then, I was a kid, so I was inspired by fantasy stuff and political stuff and, things that were happening in the '80s. And that kind of continued minus the fantasy aspect of the
Hmm.
lyrics. So, a song like Fallen Saint is just completely made up stuff, like
Yeah.
medieval type of nights. Um, but like on our last record, Hostile Defiance, I was inspired by my work. I've been working in New York as a clinical social worker, a licensed social worker for 20 years, 20 years plus. And, I worked with various populations who suffer from mental health needs, unmet mental health needs, substance abuse, and so on. So that record was heavily centered around that theme. And weirdly
Hmm.
enough, that record was released in 2019. And then in 2020, the pandemic hit, and we still have those lingering effects on people's mental health.
Yeah.
Um, so I veered off from being inspired by fantasy and really lean into things that are immediate to me, and whether it's political stuff or stuff, things that have an impact on me via work or whatnot. So yeah.
Yeah. And there's plenty of stuff to pull from like the modern day, I feel like too. It's just the chaos.
Complete insanity. I mean, like,
Yeah.
we had like, I mean, people know that I'm a pretty left. I mean, I'm a liberal person. I'm not, I try to be as even keel and as even I listened to both sides of arguments and stuff, but those years with Trump at the helm over here was like that felt super chaotic, and now it's
Yeah.
another chaos. Um,
Oh yeah.
but it was like so eventful, right? So it went from the election that was crazy, and then 4 years of Trump. Then it went into the election with Biden. That was insane. Then the pandemic. It's just constantly we're bombarded with stuff, right? Then there's
The
two
riots too.
riots. Then last week, two trains derail
Yeah.
in a week. Spill out all these toxins that nobody talks about. Seems like it's just insane. And I'm like,
The
you really
UFOs as well.
UFOs,
Yeah.
like, what is going on? So like,
Ridiculous.
there's so much stuff, and you were being constantly bombarded. So if anybody says, "Oh yeah, just kind of," it's cool wherever you draw your inspiration from. But I have plenty of stuff to write about by just turning on the news, or turning
Yeah.
on or just checking out what's going around me. And I mean, I live in New York, so I live on Long Island, but I go to Queens almost every day, and so I see plenty of craziness. So.
Yeah. So you're in Queens, and some of the bandmates are still in Germany, right?
So yeah, since we reformed in 2008, I brought in Tony, one of my oldest friends here in New York, who's been playing bass for us since 2008. And so the two of us live here. He's between Jersey and New York City. He's got an apartment in the East Village, and then he stays with his parents out in Jersey. Um, and the other three members are in Germany. So especially Ray, and then our drummer Matthias and Mark. They all live in Germany, but they also live in different parts of Germany. They're about two and a
Oh
half
wow.
hours. Yeah. So but as disjointed it may sound like, we're not disjointed at all. um all our records, for instance, since we reformed, all the Metal Blade albums have been written as a unit. So what I mean by that is that we come together, we rehearse, we write together. I mean, people prepare. I come with ideas, and everybody comes with ideas, but like all these records are not um, uh, are being written in silos. So these are all real band efforts. We just take the time to get together and rehearse on multiple occasions before we and write songs on multiple occasions before we actually track an album. So as disjointed as we are in terms of geography, our music, we always make sure our music doesn't come across like that.
Yeah. So what does that look like? Do you guys use the internet at all? Do you meet up in person?
We meet in person.
Yeah.
So yeah, so every time we go on tour, we always rehearse sets together, and then when we do work on records, like I said, we come together on multiple occasions. Like I went to Germany in November 2021. We had a session then for this upcoming album. Then last year I went to Germany. We rehearsed, and now we're working on figuring out a timeline where we can get together one more time before tracking.
Cool.
So we had, in 3 years we had three sessions, writing sessions, where we just kind of like get together and do nothing but write music, and rehearse what we have written. And then it sounds already like, when we go track for an album, people already know what to do, right? Because it came together as an organic. Like sometimes you listen to an album these days, and that people have written them. You know, people kind of individually worked on music, and then they
Yeah.
kind of threw it together, which is cool. I'm not taking anything away from bands or anybody. Everybody has their own style of approaching these matters, right? But our creative process is really locked in as a unit. I don't want to put out records that sound like I live in New York, and Ray lives in Germany, and then those three are apart as well. It's not going to sound right. So
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And that's really cool. But you guys are under Metal Blade Records now. And I've
yeah,
seen you've
yeah.
done a lot of stuff with Metal Blade on like YouTube and whatnot. How's it like
But
working with Metal Blade?
it's great for us because they give us, like, when we entered our relationship with them, um, we said, we're a little older, you know, music is when we are doing Exumer stuff, we only do Exumer stuff. But when we're not doing Exumer stuff, we all have other interests. Like my drummer, Matthias, works for Creator mainly as their drum tech. He used to own a store where he was selling drum equipment out of. He
Mm,
used to own a bar, a metal bar. So like everybody has their own other enterprise, if you will, that they pursue outside the band. When we come together and do Exumer, that's all we do. So we explained that to Metal Blade. You can't expect us to be like 20-year-olds who are going to live on the road for the next year and a half promoting our new record. We're not going to do
yeah.
that. It also doesn't work like that because we don't get like, if you're a new band, you can position yourself with bigger bands or other bands out of the genre, and you can be on a package. When you're an older band like us, when you want to tour, you might end up on a package, but most likely you'll tour on your own, and then you
Mm.
have other bands opening for yourself, for you. So we explained all that to Metal Blade, and they were cool with it. They said, you have total range. They don't expect us to write a new record every 2 years. That cycle, we don't do that anyway. And it's not because we couldn't. It's more because we want to put out records we feel right about. Because in the '80s we released 2 records, and then there was no music. And then in 2012 we came back after 25 years of not releasing anything, and then we released Fire and Damnation. And we told them, when we are ready, you'll get a record. That record's going to be quality, and you can promote it, right? And that relationship has worked, right? And they've actually renewed. Like after we put out The Raging Tides, which was our second Metal Blade album, they renewed our contract and said, you're doing really well. And that formula works for us. It's different for every band. So I'm not, I don't want to, make general statements about anything, but that's how it works for us.
Cool. Well, what you said totally shows, like in terms of quality, and you can tell, like the records you guys put out, like it is like a put out when ready, not let's just pump out another Exumer record, let's just pump out another album, because we're in 2023 and it's time to put out a record. So that's really cool. Now Metal Blade has a lot of bands now. Are there any like modern bands that inspire you guys, or is just the old school stuff?
Um, there's one band I'm friendly with, the guitar player, War Curse.
Hmm.
That's a newer band on Metal Blade. I mean, the thing is, my favorite record of last year was the last Satan album, and that was out on
Yeah.
Metal Blade. But I mean, Satan is a band from the early '80s, so to me, I am I I don't like to listen to stuff that sounds very much like the stuff that I do myself. So I'll listen to a whole lot of death metal. I'll listen to like I stoner doom stuff, a lot of jazz, anything that
Nice.
doesn't sound like me,
Yeah.
because it will be. But then there are certain bands, like sometimes there'll be a thrash album that'll just grab me, and then I'll be like, yeah, that's awesome. But they usually like like High Command. That's a cool band, right?
Mm.
But they have other elements in their music that I like. And so it's never like a straight up thrash band per se. It's more the combination of other elements that would draw me to a thrash album. like the when Power Trip released Nightmare Logic,
Yeah.
amazing album. But
Yeah.
it's not pure thrash, you know what I mean? It's not like thrash the way we'd play it. But I thought it was awesome. You know,
Yeah.
it has different elements. So that's what I'm inspired by. Or that not inspired, but that's what I really like.
Yeah,
And
cool. And I feel like Exumer, is really narrowed in on their sound already. So it's like there's no really need to, but no, that's cool. So you guys came back after a long hiatus, and it's really awesome to see you guys are putting out the same quality content that you did in the 80s. So if you don't mind me asking, like what caused the band's hiatus in 1990?
I mean, I left the band right after Possessed by Fire was released, and we were just little kids and having arguments and whatever. And we were, I mean, I was like, I stormed out of the band, which I formed with Ray, and
Yeah.
then 3 weeks later, we're all best friends again, and we just remained best friends since then. Um, and then the band went through certain permutations, and then it just didn't go anywhere. And then they said, okay, we lay it to rest. And then Ray and Bernie, the two guitar players of Exumer, we had a crossover like hip hop metal band in
It's
the 90s.
Humongous Fungus, right?
That's correct. And
Yeah.
that was stuff that we were into back then. And that was pretty successful. I mean, we did three albums, three records. One was on Noise, which was released
Hmm.
in '94. One was on Sony in '96, and then we recorded another one, but Sony shelved it. They didn't really want to put it out. And that's
Interesting.
also when I decided to come here and immigrate to the States and go to college and whatnot. So so it was just kind of like the fact that it so after I left Exumer, it kind of lost a little steam because it's always difficult to replace a vocalist, right? Because it's up to this day, it's one of the harder positions to fill in the band.
Yeah.
That and a drummer, weirdly enough. Um, uh, and then that trend continued, and then that's kind of like that's what happened. We remained friends, but the band ran its course. Paul left to the States and after the European tour in '88 or so, and he moved back to the States. So then they had another singer. So they had three vocalists within a time span of 4 or 5 years. That'll break any band.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, and again, when we put out Possessed by Fire, that record blew up for us, even back then. And people expected the continuation of Possessed by Fire, but Rising from the Sea was way more Slayer influenced, and I wasn't there. So, like, what made Possessed by Fire, I think, so successful, it was not just because it was our initial release and our debut, but it was not heavily leaning one way or another. It was
Yeah.
like Rising sounds a lot like Slayer, but if you listen to Possessed by Fire, we have influences from Exodus, Metallica, Slayer, whatever. It was like a soup, a sound soup,
Yeah.
right? And that made the album stick out because it was like, oh, cool, this song sounds like this, but now they're going into that. Now this, and I was able to channel all that with my vocal style. Whereas Paul was awesome, he fit the bill, awesome um, for the Slayer influence material, but it didn't really veer anywhere outside of that vein of Slayer. And I
Yeah.
think that kind of like already put a damper on things. And then, when he left the band, people were like, all right, we're done with this,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's awesome to have you guys back after all those years. So you were also in, you mentioned Humongous Fungus. And is that like anywhere like people can listen to that? Like, is that on Spotify or?
I think they're like I think there's a video clip on YouTube. That's pretty much it. And the records are on YouTube.
Cool.
I mean, it's completely different. It's
Yeah,
kind of
well, yeah.
yeah. It. I mean, I listen to it now, and it's pretty cringe. But at the time, it wasn't as cringe because we were in our 20s, and that was happening, and back then we really, I mean, we
It
made
was
a
like
living on it.
90s New York, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
I
there you
wasn't in New
go.
York. I wasn't.
Oh,
I wasn't even here yet, and it sounded like we wanted to make a living. I mean, we toured. I mean, we toured on those. Right, we made a lot of money when playing that style. Um, but when that was done, that's when I moved here. I came here in like '98,
hmm.
when late '98, and that's when that band also kind of like ran its course.
Yeah, and you had another band, Phobic Instinct, I
But that was
believe.
my follow-up band from Exumer.
Oh, okay.
We recorded a record for that, but that was never released. I was just thinking about that. Funny that you mentioned it.
Huh.
So the first time I came to New York was in '87, and I was staying with some friends in upstate New York and in the city, and I have my family's here too on Long Island. So and I was heavily influenced by hip hop at the time, Public Enemy, NWA, whatever was happening, especially PE, and a lot of New York hardcore. Like I was already heavily into New York hardcore, like with in '85, '86, and then when I came here, it was like game over. And then
Wow.
when I went back to Germany, I was like, let me do a crossover band that, was heavily influenced by hardcore, but had thrash elements. So that's what I did. And Phobic Instinct is an attempt of doing that. But we did record a record for No Remorse Records, which put out bands like Grinder and Blind Guardian's first album and stuff like that.
Wow.
But that record never was released until the 2000s. A friend of mine from Puerto Rico, he put out a CD with that and two other little projects I did in the '80s, and yeah, interesting stuff.
Yeah, pretty cool. So, you guys came back after, what did you say, 25 years? Was
Yeah,
it
so
exactly?
'87 was when we released Rising from the Sea,
Yeah.
and 2012 is when we released Fire and Damnation. So that was a 25-year break of releasing albums.
What prompted you to get back together with Exumer?
So to me, everything is timing, right? So life is about timing. And when in 2007 I was done with school, at least with my bachelor's degree, I did my master's, and
Where'd you go?
I went to a college here on Long Island called Adelphi.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so it's a private school, good school. It's a good Long Island. And I've got my master's from there too. But I was kind of like I had a thrash metal band here that I did stuff with called Sun Descends. And but then I was like and Ray had a rock band after I left Germany that he did with Bernie. And that ran its course. And then we're talking on the phone, and then one day I called him. I said, you know what? You know, I would really let's do Exumer again. And I had Paul come over and stay with me in New York. He lives in Hawaii. On Hawaii, he came for Halloween in 2007, and we kind of hung out. It was an awesome weekend, just partying and having a great time. And I said, let's do this. Let's. And Paul was he was working at Apple at the time. I said, let's do this. Let's put the band back together. How cliche. With Paul on Hawaii, me in New York, and Ray in Germany, and
Wow.
Paul has all this access to this technology, and that's what we did. And it was the timing was right. Paul actually went on our first tour when we first got back in 2009, and then he left the band again. But that was okay because Paul, he was always never really comfortable with this lifestyle anyway. And
Mm.
so yeah, it was all about timing, about me wanting to, thinking that we can do it. And we always said, if we put Exumer back together, it's going to be a touring band, it's going to be a recording band, it's not going to be a throwback band. I don't want to put out records that sound like 1988 with like home recording studio nonsense. I want,
Yeah.
it was like, we'll do it right, right? I mean, we're not going to tour like we're 20, but we're going to tour comfortably, and we're going to put out records that mean something, that are relevant to today's environment. And that was the vision. And I think in 2008, that's when we said, all right, we can do all those things. We can emulate these ideas that we have, and really pursue them in a meaningful way.
Yeah. What was it like getting back with Exumer on like the Five Nights of Fire tour, when like you're on stage and you're actually playing an Exumer, like all
It
the
was,
talking and actually doing it?
right. I mean, it was like twofold, right? So you are in a position where you're like, wow, these songs are like second nature to you, but at the same time they're new because you haven't performed them in like 2 decades or whatnot.
Yeah.
Um, and you haven't performed them with the intent of continuing to perform them, right? So you have to kind of take ownership of them again, even though I wrote all that, like, and it was kind of bizarre. But then, like, after that tour, we took a little break. Then we went on many other tours. Then we recorded the album, and like, so it then became like second nature again. And now, it's like we totally own the band, and like, but yeah, the five night the main thing that stuck out on that tour was that we were amazed by how many people knew us, how many people cared for it, how many new fans we had, right? So I mean, at that time we were in our 40s, and we're like already kind of like, you know, I was early 40s, and these fans come out of the woodwork. I mean, who are like 20 and they know all my songs. And I'm like, what? How's that happening? And like, so it was cool. And now, it's a regular thing. We see, a dad come with his son or daughter coming to the show, and they both know the music. They're enjoying it. So
So awesome.
yeah, it's great.
Like
Really,
listen, man, I'm like 24, so it's like I wasn't even I wasn't even
yeah,
born when the
and
first
that's
album came out.
correct. And and that's amazing to me that, that's one. So I always say, the internet is a weird place, right? Because it takes out all the mystique from when we were growing up, when we had to kind of fantasize, or not fantasize, but kind of guess how people were in their real life, or guess who, how is it like to talk to this person, or, because these bands were larger than life, right? That's gone.
Yeah.
You can now, you can buy meet and greets, and like, none of this stuff existed. When I was 16, I started working for Metal Hammer. It was like somebody giving me the keys to heaven, because
I can imagine.
I was like, I went to shows. I had backstage laminates for every show. I did interviews. I mean, I used to interview Metallica every time they would come, all the way until 1986. I'm like, everybody would talk to them on the, like, I remember when they played the Metal Hammer Festival in '85, they had a press conference, and then I talked to Lars exclusively, right? Stuff like that. So, I mean, that's happening as a 16, 17-year-old, right? So what I'm trying to illustrate was how valuable those experiences were to me, and how how impressive impressive, impressionable I was, right? Even though I had to play it cool, right? But now all that's gone, because you can buy all that.
Yeah.
Back then, you couldn't buy any of that. Like, either you were or you weren't, right? Either you knew people or you didn't know them. And so, but on the flip side of that, the access to music and and history and all that, that would not be possible without the internet and the information we have, the access to information we have these days. So I can't run around and say, oh, everything sucks. The good old days is where it's at. And at the same time say, oh, it's cool that I have 20, 24-year-old fans. How the hell
Yeah.
would you know about me if you wouldn't have access to my music? Or even younger people. Like, we play in Moscow and there's, we play Moscow twice, and each of those times, packed house, Moscow. What?
Yeah.
You couldn't even get into Moscow back when I was growing up. They're just impossible. Now you can't go back either, but different reason. But you know what I mean? Like, all that is happening because what's going on with with the connectivity of societies, which was not happening in the 80s. But yeah, so
Yeah,
that's
it's wild.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, and like I discovered you guys actually like through Spotify and streaming,
Oh,
where it's
yeah.
like, fans also like this, and you go down a rabbit hole and just
Right,
discover all
right.
these bands. So it's so awesome. And like Moscow, you wouldn't you
Yeah, we
wouldn't
went
think at
there.
all.
It was great. I mean, this was obviously way before all this nonsense started.
Yeah.
But it was great. We didn't know what to expect, and then we went back again. It was like, I think we played 2014, and we went back in 2017, and we played Moscow twice. We played St. Petersburg once. It's great, awesome. But like I said, you find yourself in a place that was completely unattainable in the 80s. I mean, not happening. I mean, when we recorded Possessed by Fire, we drove through Eastern Germany in on a transit route. So
Yeah.
that was all staked out and you couldn't veer off. So you entered Berlin, West Berlin, where all the studios were and all the punks and hardcore people, and an island on its own, because there's no draft. Back then there was draft in Germany. West Berlin, there was no draft. And you could not get into any Eastern Bloc country without special visas and stuff, and like there's no metal,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and now and then move forward 25 years or 30 years, and then just kind of like, just fly into Moscow, play Moscow, no problem, bunch of people, awesome equipment, awesome venues, great food, great drinks, everything is, I mean, like, what?
Yeah, it's so perfect now, but a lot of people will argue like they do miss the community aspect of it because you look at back like early 80s like Metallica, like Lars brought the Diamond Head Lightning to the Nations cassette, and then everyone discovered him through that almost. So you do almost lose that, but I feel like it's a worthy sacrifice because now you have everything at your fingertips.
So, you know, it's cool to be nostalgic because what happens is it's an emotional thing, right? You have, especially for people my age, you have an emotional attachment to the 80s, which is perfectly fine because that's when we came of age, right? I was 12 years old in 1980 and the world was my oyster musically, everything. Um, and so I go back to those emotions. But the reality is, there's a lot of stuff that sucked, what I just mentioned in
Yeah.
terms of, not everything was accessible, and it was just a different world, geopolitically, geographically, everything. And so yeah, I mean, it's cool to be nostalgic about those days. And yes, listen, I always say the same thing. The the wealth of artistic of artistry, whether it's writing, painting, music, that was happening in the early 80s, I don't think you can attain that anytime soon in the future or now or whatever. Because if you think about it, we're on the heels of the punk rock movement, and then comes like these post-punk new wave stuff, Joy Division, stuff like that, The Cure. That's happening. Metal is happening. Like all this stuff is just kind of like New York hardcore, you know, and that bled into the early 90s, like grunge, all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
That period is, I'm always, I and think about it. None of these bands that I just mentioned sound alike. None of them, you know, different genres. They were considered a genre. Like, you have Sisters of Mercy, same genre as The Cure. They don't sound anything like each other. And even like in thrash or death metal, or like, you had Death, Possessed, Celtic Frost, whatever. None of these bands sounded alike. Everything's its own thing. And now that's the one thing that I miss, right? I mean, going back is, everybody puts out stuff the way they want to sound like, and there's a distinct sound of everything. And now it's a lot more cookie cutter,
Yeah.
and that's the thing. Guitar tones are very alike, drum sounds are very alike, so that's the thing I miss, but whatever, it's all good.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's true. I feel like a lot of metal bands now, you get like that very modern production, and a lot of it is just like it's just all the same production. I feel like it was a much more distinct, and that's why I love about your modern records, because there is like almost an old school sense to it, but there's something new also added that isn't just like every other band. It's very distinct, which is really awesome. Now, speaking of new music, can fans expect another Exumer record?
Yeah, so we're
Oh
working on
yeah.
it. Yeah, so we were targeting to release it this year, but what is happening, and you're quite aware of it because I see you collect vinyl. Um, the pre-production dates for vinyl are so stretched out in the future, and I don't want to. I mean, my collection is rather large, and I am very much about that medium,
Yeah.
and I want that type of media to be represented when we put out our records. So what happens is the pre-production time is 6 months. So if we want to have an album out in the summer of 2023, you got to put in
Six
the
months.
6 months. So in January, you have to put in your audio master and your artwork for it to. And we are already fast tracked, right? Because we're connected. I mean, Metal Blade in Europe is connected. It's distributed via Sony, so we have access to all their channels, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's still 6 months, because then not Michael Jackson, but any, I don't know, any band that is huge on Sony will come and they'll, or record store day or something that they think they need to produce records quickly on vinyl. They'll, I mean, we're nobody, right?
So they'll
They'll
just
just,
bump other artists,
yeah,
pretty
they'll just
much.
bump
Wow.
whatever. So in order to that not from happening, so if you put in back in the day it was 3 months, right? Which is pretty normal,
Not bad.
sensible time frame. Yeah. So if you put in your audio master and artwork, you put it in I don't know, October, it'll come out in January, perfectly fine, right? And it'll give the label time to promote it, send out advanced music and stuff like that. Now it's 6 months. So we're like, listen, we're not, I don't want to, so the earliest that we can hand in anything will be probably summer to fall of
Wow.
this year. And then you tag on the 6 months
Like, jeez.
pre-production. So, and then you land in like early spring of 2024.
Cool.
That's how it works.
Wow.
We wanted to put it out this year, but it's just not realistic. And I don't want to put out our record, when everybody else is releasing. When Maiden and Megadeth and everybody's dropping their
Metallica's
records.
putting something
Metallica,
out.
like
Yeah.
you can't, you can't, because people there's a sea of releases every month, an ocean of releases, and people just have X amount of money. And I don't want to play that game where I'm like, oh, everybody loves it, but they can't afford to buy the vinyl because they already bought 3 other records. I don't want that. So we strategically release records in certain periods where there is not that much competition in terms of selling physical media. So
Yeah, totally understandable. So is like would you say the album's totally written out? Are you
no,
still
it's not
writing?
written out. No. We're still writing, but it's coming together.
Yeah.
Like we are, so we're gonna probably look for recording it towards the fall, and then once we're done recording it, then we'll hand in everything, and then it'll probably be released in the spring of 24. So that's what we're.
Awesome. Well, great news. So you guys have a ton of dates lined up for this
Yeah,
year.
we're gonna get busy this year. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Are there any certain dates, any specific ones you're like extremely excited about, or is it just
yeah. I'm
yeah?
really looking forward to going back there. I love playing LA. This is gonna be our third show in LA. Yeah, both shows we played in LA were huge. They were great and awesome energy, and they bring the old school. I mean, those kids, they look like 1986. They know everything about
Yeah.
1986. So I'm really into that. So
There's still a thrash scene there, and there's still like,
huge.
kids in their 20s, like early 20s, like putting out thrash metal. It's really awesome. Like it's still around and really awesome to see. But um thank you so much, man, for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
My
are there
pleasure.
any way what's the best way for fans to keep in touch with the band? Website, social
Yeah, I
media?
mean, the best way is through our socials, um, Instagram, Facebook. I check them all the time, so I talk to fans if, as needed. And my Instagram is not private, so if you want to hit me up, hit me up. You can check out my records. I post
Cool,
records every
awesome.
day.
Cool. Well, I'll totally give you a follow, man.
Right,
Thank
my
you so
man.
much for coming on.
You got it, brother. Take care.
Awesome. Yeah.
Bye
I'm
bye.
Brandon Baddick, and this has been Disturbing the Priest.